it's my great pleasure to introduce our next guest, Stuart Gulliver, who was the Group Chief Executive Officer of HSBC Bank until last year, and now sits on many boards, including Jardines and the Asia House Advisory Board.
Stuart, welcome. Really good to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. I have to start with US-China, different views on how that's going to play out. Phase one deal in the offing, it seems, but potentially a huge amount more uncertainty and the core issues not addressed. What's your readout?
So it's very similar to what we've already heard, which is you get a phase one deal. The timing, I'm sure, will be chosen to best suit the political agenda of the US elections, of when that deal is actually signed. But it will leave unsolved issues that we heard the other panelists talk about, which is the state capitalist model that China has and the advantages that that gives Chinese companies and SOEs, the intellectual property issues and the extent to which intellectual property is transferred from the West to China. And that's probably undoubtedly so that China becomes less dependent on the West, so that you can see where that need comes from. But again, that eventually leads to a very bifurcated world where there's completely different technical standards in China and the countries that need to associate with China and the West. And it probably also leaves undone many of the other sort of detailed issues that have sat around these trade agreements. So I'm sure we're going to get something on in the phase one that deals with agriculture, that deals with probably winding back some of the tariffs that definitely are quite clearly hitting the US consumer through Walmart's increased prices on goods, and therefore tend not to sort of fit the narrative if it's the Chinese consumer that's paying the cost of this. But the bigger issues around, the intellectual property, the business model of the Chinese state will remain unsolved, I think, or very, very complicated to solve, and probably aren't even covered in the 150-page document that was the draft that was put together between the two sides. So I think this is going to remain a knotty issue for some time.
Yeah, how do you advise businesses to position themselves, given it looks likely that while there might be a few positive noises with phase one deal, the core issues aren't going to be addressed and the tensions will remain?
I think most multinational companies are tuned into this very fact and have probably been managing their supply chains really since President Trump dialed up the rhetoric around this particular issue. And I don't think that people would be at this moment in time expecting peace to break out anytime soon or to have any kind of specificity. So I don't think there's a big change in the way basically multinationals have had to run themselves for the last couple of years.
The trade conflict has hit the global economy, no doubt about it, well documented. There's talk of a slowdown next year and potentially even a recession. What's your take on how the economy will be next year?
So actually, the US economy looks a little bit stronger, and actually the Fed's rate cuts have actually changed the shape of the yield curve. So we did have an inverted curve, which tends to suggest, by definition, everyone here is financially sophisticated, so I've no need to unpack why an inverted yield curve suggests a slowdown. But we've got a curve that's now flattened, and we've got reasonably strong signs of a prolongation of US GDP growing in a positive way, albeit at more modest levels than we've seen previously. So a lot of the chatter around the US is in a recession next year has actually died away, and I think the Fed reacted very, very quickly to stop that actually happening. The thing that always is going to be at the back of everyone's mind is we're at the very late stage of a bull market. And the extent to which that bull market can continue and on what basis it continues is obviously a question that everyone who's investing money is constantly having to deal with, because obviously you come out the market too soon, you will underperform everyone. And obviously you stay too late, you'll also underperform everyone. So we are at that, and that's part of the reason I think why the market keeps going back up, is that people come out and then are forced to buy back in. There's a certain sign of this in the fact that markets keep going ever upwards. So I think there is uncertainty around, and most of that uncertainty clearly is derived from political events in a very long-running bull market, which we all expect at some point to correct. I don't, however, see 2020 or 2021 as being, at this moment in time, having huge warning signals.
Right, so we're not at the correction point or way off the correction point.
I think it would be very hard for you and I to actually call that correction point.
I think you'd probably have better luck at it than me.
No, I think with your Reuters background, you could probably guess it better than me, have a much better headline than I would have.
Let's move on to a couple of other issues. The PBOC announced it's going to launch a digital currency. How does one read that? This is a significant step, or is this symbolic? Is this a response to Libra?
So there's a whole bunch of stable coins around.
Yeah.
So Libra was obviously a very big attempt by Facebook, together with I think 26, 27 partners, to effectively create a stable coin, a digital currency that would not effectively be under the control of central banks, under the control of governments. And obviously the regulatory structure of the world central banks have reacted to that by saying, well, hang on a second, before you do this, we're going to actually put in place a control framework ahead of you doing it. And the reason I point that out is obviously the big tech companies have operated in a winner-takes-all environment. So if you look at the size of the tech companies, they have operated in a winner-takes-all environment where their market shares are colossal and dominant. And only now do you start seeing, for example, with the EU, looking at regulating the big tech companies, looking at actually saying we need to pay some tax, and all of these kind of basic things have come 5-6 years after they've been very dominant. And what the central bankers are saying is, well, we're not going to do it after you've done Libra. We're going to think about this before you even get into it, because obviously the banking system is a leverage play on the real economy, and therefore there are bigger issues. And there are also these strategic issues about having private companies control money, i.e. to control what a stable coin, whether it's Libra or anything else, would be is, a unit of account, a store of value, and a means of exchange. So there are kind of policy issues around it. Now, central bank stable coins probably come out of some of the logic of, can you make the payment system even faster and more efficient? There's a positive and a negative to that as well. The negative could be you end up simply with all of us just dealing with the central bank. Because most places you have a two-tier system. You have commercial banks who basically clear all of their payments through a central bank. But if effectively the central bank is itself replaced its money and notes in circulation with a digital token, you and I could just deal directly with that central bank. Actually, there's not a great deal of evidence of well-run, state-owned banks that actually conduct day-to-day banking activities. The other stablecoin idea with central banks is obviously Mark Carney's suggestion that the dollar, which has been the dominant currency for a very, very long time, creates some structural imbalances in the world. The US, I think, has got 10% of world trade, but 50% of all trade settles in dollars. I think 1/3 of the countries in the world have pegged their currencies to the dollar, and something like the number of countries that I think are worth about 70% of world GDP are again aligned to the dollar. So there's a disproportionate usage of the dollar compared to where the US sits in terms of world trade and so on. And what he proposed at Jackson Hole was that you need to create a network of central bank stable coins that may eventually replace the US dollar. Because his thinking is not that the dollar gets eventually replaced by the renminbi, because that could be 20, 30, 40 years away, but actually you'd have a sort of joint and several responsibility of several countries. All of these innovations will continue. It's just like, but they'll all go through the kind of the Gartner sort of technological development graph, which has the exciting point, and then you have this trough of disillusionment, and then it emerges into a point where you get adaptation. We'll go through these type of hype, disappointment, and then adaptation, and that adaptation will take place.
Yeah. Do you see, though, that the China's decision to go down the digital currency route, possibly faster than some might have imagined, accelerates this de-dollarization?
I don't know. I don't have that information. What I do think is, obviously, in China, you have two significant big tech, big data companies that are massive in the payment system. So you obviously have Tencent and Alibaba, or Ant as a subsidiary of Alibaba. And Ant has a money market fund, which I think translated into English is leftover treasure or something. Victor will be able to say it well in Mandarin, which I can't. And that is the biggest money market fund in the world. So you've got a non-bank with the biggest money market fund in the world, which therefore creates some kind of structural risk. So therefore, PBOC has now moved to a point of requiring effectively that to clear in the same clearing system as the bank system. So I would imagine the reason why PBOC is sophisticated in this regard is because it has in WePay Tencent and in Alipay and Ant, two of the most dominant big tech companies in the payments, in wealth management, and in lending to SMEs that you can see anywhere in the world.
Stuart's willing to take some questions, so please get ready and I'll come to the audience in just a moment. I want to move on to the banking industry now, and McKinsey put out a report recently saying that if mainstream banks don't adopt fintech and change, they risk being assigned as footnotes in history, something along those lines. As someone who's until very recently run one of the biggest banks in the world,
yes,
is that a serious risk?
I think that there is a risk that, I think, look, the banking industry is different than most industries. Most industries, if you think about it, have ended up with maybe 10 global players. So you think about chemicals, pharmaceuticals, steel, etc., car makers, you've consolidated. Banking still has thousands of banks. And part of the reason for this is the whole too big to fail risk. So it's an industry that's never really consolidated, right? So there's an awful lot of banks, and an awful lot of those banks probably don't get a great return on capital today. There are significant threats to the banking industry that come across the pace, but I think that threat is primarily coming from not fintech, but big tech. So it sounds like a distinction without a difference, but fintech coming up with faster, quicker ways for consumers to interact with their day-to-day financial needs, yes, takes a big chunk of revenue out of the banking system. But the thing that's a tremendous threat to all banks are the very big data pools that big tech have, and that's a very real issue. And you can start to see, again, with Ant, and there's a couple of them in South America, in Brazil and Argentina as well, which are doing a phenomenal job, which you can argue from a policy point of view is a great thing, of increasing financial inclusion, because they are able to bank companies, particularly SMEs, that the traditional banking system would struggle to. A lot of very small SMEs don't have audited accounts. They don't have tons of collateral they can put up. But if you have the data going through to make credit decisions based on basically AI and machine learning, because you are actually on the ecosystem through that SME buys it, supplies it, and then sells to consumers, you can make probably a better informed credit decision than a human could within a bank. So therefore, there will be changes from big tech. Big tech, however, will, rather like you've seen in China, end up with some form of regulation. And there will also be issues around such things as how transactional a big tech lending platform is. So when you hit a recession, generally speaking, banks are, and certainly the one that I worked for my entire working life, and my chairman's sitting there as the chairman of the Asia House as well. We had a philosophy that when the going got tough, we stood behind our customers. So when it got really difficult, that's the point at which you never walked away. So if you flip that round into banking, do you get surge pricing? So the equivalent of what you have in a sort of cloud, hailing a cab environment, it's busy. Do you get surge pricing and lending, which puts everyone out of business, or do you just simply pull away? So the regulators, we've all got to sort of look at that. But big tech, the big platforms, absolutely are a threat to traditional banks. I do not believe that banks will be a footnote, but I do believe that the industry, as opposed to picking on anyone in particular, absolutely has to deal with this. Absolutely has to deal with this.
Okay. Some questions from the audience, please. Put your hand in the air and I will bring around a microphone.
Yeah, excellent.
Please.
Oh, no.
Hi, Ed Radcliffe from Asia House. I wonder, there's been a lot of discussion so far this morning, particularly about US-China, focusing on China in particular. Is there a risk that the sort of the US-China issues and China specifically is sort of blinding us in terms of the risks and the threats to global trade and the threats to global business? Are there other things that we should be looking at, whether that's sort of climate change or issues in the Middle East, oil prices, that sort of thing? So we'd like to get your views on that.
So if you're running a bank, a large bank, what's different, I think, than, say, 15 years ago is you have this big issue of big tech. You absolutely need to be aware of the whole climate change green agenda and the extent to which government policy and social pressure will cause the sources of energy that we all rely on to move to less use of fossil fuels. And therefore, as a bank, you need to be extremely aware of two things: the extent to which you yourself are helping that process take place, so green bonds and by looking at your lending policy, but actually the risk also that you don't end up with all of the stranded assets of XYZ mining company, oil and gas company or whatever, which now is actually stuck in the ground and they can't get out, and therefore becomes a colossal bad debt for you. I think that in terms of geopolitical risk, there is still, and I think has always been throughout my working life, instability in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the extent to which that fluctuates through in the oil price, which clearly has a dramatic impact from time to time on, since we are still reliant on fossil fuels, on actually economic activity. And I think that for the banking industry generally, there remains this enormous need to tighten up the ability of the banking industry to basically deal with money laundering. So the other thing that changed, I think, over the last 10, 12 years, and probably with the US banks, changed at the time of 9/11, actually after 9/11, but I think for the European banks were slower to adopt to the fact that as a policy decision, governments have decided to use the banking system as the first line of defense to try and keep bad actors out of the, if you like, the conventional financing system. By the way, that will be a big problem for the big data companies as well, to be able to evidence that they can do the KYC, the customer due diligence, and the transaction monitoring. But all of those things are very different than 15 years ago. And as I say, it is absolutely the case now that I think most banks have invested in the tech necessary to be able to do the pattern recognition, to be able to spot networks that exist, if you like, just below the surface amongst their own clients across multiple countries. In terms of risk beyond US-China, US-China is dominant. I mean, it is a huge part of world trade. And the extent to which we end up with seeing the last few years as the high point of globalization, which it could well be, looking back in history, we have hit a high point for a period of time. I think we will end up with, if you like, a lower normative level of GDP growth than we would otherwise do if these negotiations don't turn out to deliver a solution that enables both sides to be able to, with some change and amendment, grow their own economies and improve the lot and social well-being of their populations.
Final question, Stuart, because we're slightly over time. When you became CEO of HSBC, and when you stepped down as CEO, the job probably became a lot tougher for various reasons. If you're looking ahead 10 years' time, how tough will it be to run a major international bank, and what will the challenges be?
So I think what will be an issue, and your next session's on this disruptive financial technology, will be, I think the big risk for banks, so HSBC is a universal bank, so it had commercial banking, so SMEs, and trade finance, which we had the biggest market share in trade finance. A retail banking piece, a global banking markets piece, and a private banking piece. I think the bit that gets hollowed out is there's a huge threat within retail banking. So you have someone from Revolut here. Revolut has already significantly impacted the revenue pool for retail foreign exchange payments in the UK, because the UK clearing banks charged a healthy margin, and Revolut offers the man in the street interbank prices. So there's an immediate revenue hit. So I think that therefore the shape of a universal bank will change. I think if you're running a pure play retail bank, you've got huge problems coming from the big data, fintech, as I say, big tech guys. Yeah. As I say, if you're running a universal bank, it wouldn't surprise me if 10 years' time HSBC looked more like it did probably in 1865 when it started. It was beards. It was basically a corporate bank that financed maritime trade. I mean, it basically banked small, medium-sized, and large corporates, and it didn't have a retail piece. And it wouldn't surprise me if that bit is harder to disintermediate. It's harder at this moment to see, Ant doesn't want to lend $25 billion US to X doing an M&A deal for Y, okay? But it absolutely wants to lend to the mom and pop store because it's got all the data about the payments that are going through that mom and pop store, which actually the bank doesn't have. So I think you'll see a universal banking model probably, that's the bit I think that will change. You'll end up with corporate banks. And I think the retail piece is definitely going to be threatened and challenged by the developments that we can see in some of the speakers you have in the next session.
Stuart, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Stuart Gulliver.